Sir, I'm sorry. I heard your first statement that, I know I'm going to butcher the name, but I'm vaguely familiar with the case. The Florida State professor, Samael Harayan, I heard you say that he's not guilty of anything except for supporting Palestinian aspirations. In fact, I believe he's been convicted in a court of law of conspiracy to aid and abet terrorism.
No, not at all. Not a single charge was presented by the U.S. government against this guy. And since the time of U.S. General Lino, he's been back in jail. Since he's 13 and they don't know where to report him to. He has no record. No one will take him. They stuck with him, like they stuck with me. When I graduated from BU, Israel will not take him because I'm not the Jewish player.
I'll have to do some more research into that case. My understanding is that he was arrested, that there were protestations about his innocence, but since there have been developments that call that seriously into question, you might know more about it than I do. But since we're talking on a legal point, I also need to revisit something that Professor Gilbert has mentioned a number of times, and that is the precious right of habeas corpus, which is a U.S. constitutional right, a protection for Americans on American soil. It is not a policy of war. It is not a policy that applies even to POWs who are lawful combatants, let alone unlawful combatants who were part of a terrorist effort to attack the United States. Habeas corpus is a domestic justice concept, not a war concept. And Professor Gilbert, for as wonderful as it may be, it would be a terrible way to conduct security operations defending the United States in violent conflict.
All right. I'd like to ask a quick question of the professor. I know earlier you spoke about how American role in, well, I guess we don't have to put torture in quotes, but how our response to 9/11 and the torture that allegedly took place afterwards has negatively impacted the view of the United States. So what I'd like to ask is kind of in relation to the 1993 First World Trade Towers attacks, in which our prosecution of those responsible was not in the form of a Guantanamo style. I mean, there's some still at Florence in the Supermax. We released them. There were no instances of torture, etc. Yet we had the attack in the Kobar Towers. We had the attack on the USS Cole. How then can you say that just because of American actions on torture, looking at how it wound up, increasing American public opinion, for radical Muslims after how we treated the first attack on the World Trade Center?
Al-Qaeda is a criminal organization, and it seeks to kill Christians and Jews, and it has fantasies about establishing an Islamic caliphate without the toleration of other peoples of the book of the great Islamic caliphates. The leader of Al-Qaeda was run by the CIA and trained in terror by the CIA and was turned against the United States after he helped take down the government of Afghanistan because the United States established military bases on the holy sites in Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. There were also great crimes not reported in the American press against the Palestinians, and the boycott carried out by both the first Bush administration and especially the Clinton administration, forcing the UN by UN statistics, these are UN statistics, to enact policies which resulted in the death of 4,500 children a month through the 1990s. You can cut the figure in a quarter, it doesn't do much good. There are plenty of reasons why people don't like the United States, which ought to be dealt with now by people of decency of all parties and all persuasions. But the fact is that we have committed the crime of torture. It has been ordered by the highest up people here, and it will not go away by pretending that it doesn't exist and talking about state secrets. Susan Crawford, the head of the prosecutions at Guantanamo appointed by Cheney said that the treatment of Mohammed al-Qahtani amounted to torture. There are literally hundreds of cases, and one real problem in Shawn Mitchell's account is that the US government has kept secret what it has done there. It has not come out because we have these people the courage to defend what they do in the light of day. George Bush, in a fantasy world, says we do not torture. And a lot of people, including some Democrats, stood up and applauded. The time has come to deal with this.
I appreciate the question that highlights that there was an escalating series of attacks on American interests and installations prior to September 11th, prior to what much of the left describes as George Bush's unjustified provocations of the Muslim world. In fact, there was a war coming against the United States and against Israel long before any of the current controversy developed, before the instances which Professor Gilbert cites. We could become a docile, pacifist nation, and there is an ideology that would still hate us for what we believe and what we don't believe, and would continue to attack American interests wherever and whenever possible. And that's the reality that we face and will continue to face.
We have our director here directing, and we're going to take one more very brief question with very brief answers.
Anyone who believes that there is no torture routinely in American jails and prisons in every city and practically every county in the United States has ignored at least 100 years of history. And so I invite you to examine the basis upon which you made your earlier statement regarding routine torture in America. Nonetheless, the reason the job was farmed out to the CIA by the Bush administration to commit torture is precisely because the Army Field Manual, at least ostensibly, prohibits torture. And this was a method to avert the clear implications that it was law-breaking on a rampant scale under international law. If you are, in fact, a former military personnel, then you should be familiar with the Army Field Manual and its proscription against torture as a technique for interrogation. Furthermore, Kwiatkowski, who was briefly in charge of Abu Ghraib, said that those techniques were brought there from Guantanamo, having been practiced earlier, and then imported directly under the aegis of both CIA and military personnel. So to insinuate that those were not authorized at some higher level, for which there ought to be a broad investigation, is no excuse to justify those who authorized it on the grounds that it was somehow rogue agents or military personnel without adequate training, reservists, and so on. Thank you.
Well, sorry to disappoint you, but despite my broad shoulders and rough and ready appearance, the closest I've gotten to the military is watching A Few Good Men. Yeah, that line. Thanks, that helped out my psyche up here. Your first comment about routine physical abuse in American jails and prisons, I don't doubt that some of it happens, and to the extent it does, it highlights further the absurdity of trying to basically take down an American administration for serious pursuit of American security and armed conflict if comparable activities are happening here, there, and everywhere. If we need to make the world a better place, we need to make the world a better place.